love, with just this needle and thread. I believe I can hold our whole home together." Mary's gentle voice echoed in the dim room, where the flicker of an oil lamp cast long shadows of the poor couple. James Miller, a thin tailor with calloused hands from years of sewing, lifted his head to look at his wife. In his eyes was the steady resolve of a man who had grown used to stitching late into the night in exchange for a little rice, a little bread to feed his family. He nodded and smiled. "As long as there is still a needle and thread, we will never go hungry." The small village sat just outside the big city. There, the poor crowded into rickety wooden huts, roofs leaking in the rain, suffocating in the heat of summer. James ran a tiny tailor's shop, really nothing more than an old wooden table, a few spools of thread, a blunt pair of scissors, and a wobbly chair. But he had skillful hands and a heart that loved the craft. His customers were often farmers, vegetable sellers, and even little children who needed their torn clothes patched. James never charged much. Many times. Mary watched her husband accept a sack of potatoes instead of a few coins, and she only sighed without reproach. Life was hard, but they had each other. Mary, the young village wife, was beautiful and gentle. She carried water, washed clothes, and sometimes helped her husband trim threads. In her eyes, James was not a poor tailor, but a man rich in love. Yet peace rarely lasted. One afternoon, the sound of hooves thundered down the dirt road. People stirred in surprise. A luxurious carriage stopped right in front of the tiny tailor's shop. The door swung open, and out stepped Lord Henry, the infamous nobleman of the town. He wore a velvet cloak, polished leather shoes, and golden rings on his fingers. Henry's eyes swept around before stopping on Mary, who was folding cloth. A thin smile curled on his lips. "Oh, so this is the Poor Tailor's shop everyone talks about. How amusing." His voice dragged, half mocking, half scornful. James wiped his hands and bowed. "What service do you require?" "Lord Henry." The noble looked him up and down, cold eyes sharp. But when he turned to Mary, his tone softened. "A beautiful woman like you. What a waste in this shabby hut. Tell me, girl, wouldn't you prefer to wear gowns embroidered in gold rather than this coarse cloth?" Mary froze, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. James stepped in front of his wife. "Please, my lord, show respect." Henry sneered. "Respect I only want to help her escape poverty. A gown of gold embroidery is nothing to me. But to you, it is something you could never afford in your lifetime. Isn't it?" The words cut like knives. The villagers whispered, some with pity, some with cruel laughter. Mary lowered her head, her heart aching. James clenched his hand tight, yet his composure did not break. That night, in their thatched hut, Mary quietly mended her husband's shirt. The needle trembled in her hands. She dared not raise her eyes. James laid a hand on her shoulder. "Do not let his words trouble you," Mary asked softly. "But what if he is right? What if you can never give me anything beautiful? What if all my life I must wear rough cloth?" James choked on silence. He looked at his calloused hands, at the crisscross stitches on old fabric. He loved his wife, yet a wave of helplessness surged in him. Outside, the laughter of the wealthy echoed from the tavern in town. Inside their small home, the silence pressed down like a falling wall. That night, James did not sleep. He held the needle, staring at the lamp's flame. A thought rose in his heart. I will prove it. I will sew a gown so fine, even a noble will have to bow his head. The next morning, James began. He gathered every piece of cloth, leaving some as thin as paper and some frayed at the edges, cutting and piecing them together into a base. Mary watched him rush about, torn between worry and tenderness. "My love, don't push yourself. A splendid embroidered gown isn't so simple." James only smiled. "I'm not forcing myself. This is a promise. Day after day." He labored. The sharp needle pierced the fabric, each tiny rip sounding in a steady rhythm. He stitched flowers, leaves, winding borders. His hands bled with pain, but his eyes shone with faith. Villagers stopped by and shook their heads. A poor tailor dreaming nonsense. Embroidered gowns are only for nobles. But James never gave up. Another afternoon. Henry passed by again. He stood at the doorway, peering through a crack, seeing James bent over his frame of fabric. Henry smirked, then deliberately raised his voice. "Poor Tailor, do you think a patched-together gown will change your fate? Wait until I place a necklace of pearls around your wife's neck. Then she will know what true wealth is." Mary heard it, and her heart clenched. Promises and temptations swirled in her mind. James bit down hard on his lip, the needle nearly slashing his finger. That was the seed of conflict. On one side, love in poverty. On the other hand, the lure of wealth. And from that moment, the clash began to grow, like a blade hanging above their heads. The first embroidered aodai came to life after many sleepless nights. James laid it on the wooden table and breathed a sigh of relief. The fabric was not luxurious, just plain dyed cloth. Yet every stitch bloomed like a flower under his hand. Red, blue, and yellow blossoms stood out vividly against the grey fabric, like life bursting forth amid hardship. Mary touched it, her eyes sparkling. Beautiful, so beautiful. But will it be enough to silence the whispers? James squeezed his wife's hand. "I don't sew for them to see. I sew so you can believe." But on the day the dress was brought to the market, Lord Henry appeared. He stepped down from his carriage and walked slowly over, his eyes filled with disdain. An embroidered aodai, It looks painstaking, but it is nothing more than a peasant's trick. "Young lady, if you wear this, the world will laugh. But if you wear my pearl necklace..." He clapped his hands, and a servant brought out a wooden box. Inside lay a necklace of shining white pearls, each bead as large as a fingernail, glistening under the sun. Mary froze. Whispers spread through the market. Real pearls. Never seen any shine like that in a lifetime. Henry smiled, emphasizing each word. True beauty does not lie in cheap thread and needles. It lies in jewels and gold. "Choose the patched dress, or this necklace of pearls," Mary choked, her hands trembling. The reflection of the pearls flickered in her eyes, making her suddenly feel so small in her worn dress. James stood beside her, his heart aching. He could see his wife's wavering clearly. That night, they quarreled for the first time. Mary whispered, "I don't need pearls." But, "James, if everyone keeps saying you are poor, I will not bear those looks anymore." James gripped the scissors tightly, his voice hardening. "Then let me prove it. Pearls are not the only things that shine." He threw himself into work, but this time he did not only embroider flowers, he tried shaping birds, shaping the sky, pouring all his strength and love into every stitch. His fingers swelled red, blood soaking the cloth, yet he did not stop. Mary watched, tears falling, but in her heart a question flickered. Was it worth it? Henry did not stop. He changed tactics. One morning, a grand carriage stopped right in front of James's house. Henry did not enter the shop, but went straight to the yard where Mary was hanging cloth. He smiled, his voice sweet as honey. "You are as lovely as wildflowers, but you should bloom in the royal garden. Let me give you what that tailor can never provide." Then he raised his hand. Before Mary's eyes, from nowhere, appeared a piece of cloth embroidered with flowers that truly blossomed. Petals trembled. Fragrance wafted gently. It was no longer embroidery, but magic. Mary gasped. "Oh, flowers. Are they alive?" Henry smiled triumphantly. "Yes, with me. Just a thread is enough to make flowers bloom. With him, a lifetime of sewing will only give stiff drawings." His words cut like a knife. Mary clutched her chest, shaken. In her heart, James suddenly seemed small, fragile against such sorcery. James overheard and stepped out. He looked at the trembling petals on the cloth and knew Henry had surpassed him not only in wealth, but also in magical power. He clenched his teeth, his eyes darkening. "You may have magic, but love cannot be bought with false blossoms." Henry burst out laughing. "Love, ha ha ha, when hungry. People need bread. When weary, they need warm clothes. When she sees pearls, when she sees real flowers, she will understand. Love cannot patch a torn dress." Mary trembled, turning away. She said nothing, but her eyes brimmed with confusion. James reached out, wanting to hold her hand, but she pulled back slightly. Night fell, and the house was pitch dark. Mary sat by the window, gazing into the distance. James sewed in silence, but suddenly the needle and thread felt meaningless. She choked out James. "I believed in you. But now, my heart is in turmoil. On one side is you. On the other is the whole world of wealth Henry paints. I fear I can no longer stand firm." James lowered his head. He understood. This battle was no longer between thread and pearls. It was a battle to hold on to his wife's heart. The conflict reached its peak. Henry continued appearing at the market, at the village well, wherever Mary went. Always with that arrogant smile, always with gifts that drew everyone's admiration. The villagers began to whisper, "If Mary wears pearls, she will become a lady. James is dirt poor. How can he keep such a beautiful wife?" Those words fell like rain into James's ears. He grew more and more exhausted. The more he sewed, the more despair swallowed him. At last, on a night of fierce winds, James collapsed beside his sewing table. The needle fell, the thread tangled. He clenched his fists and prayed silently. "If there is magic, please let me, just once prove that love shines brighter than pearls, brighter than false blossoms." Outside, the wind howled, as though carrying with it destiny's hidden answer. The wind that night was not an ordinary wind. It swirled through the cracks of the door, blew out the oil lamp, and then suddenly stopped right in front of James's sewing table. In the dim darkness, a faint light appeared from the old spool of thread. The thread glowed like moon silk, trembling, then quietly flowed into James's hand. He opened his eyes, stunned. A whisper rose, as if from far away. "True tailor, your needle has stitched blood and tears. Now stitch with your heart, and you will see flowers truly bloom." James trembled, but he did not hesitate. He picked up the needle and threaded the glowing strand through it. One stitch, then another. Each petal appeared, not stiff or lifeless, but quivering. A gentle fragrance spread, filling the house. Mary gasped, watching as the embroidered flowers on the cloth slowly opened their petals like real blossoms. "James, is this a miracle?" she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. James looked at his wife, smiling with a hoarse voice. "No, this is love. Love has stitched every single one of these threads." The next day, the market was crowded. Rumors had spread across the village the poor tailor had sewn living flowers. People swarmed to see. James placed the long embroidered gown with blooming flowers in the center of the market. The blossoms swayed under the sunlight, releasing a fragrance that astonished everyone. Mary stood beside him, hesitant, her heart full of emotions. She remembered Henry's words, the necklace, the false blossoms, then looked again at James, his thin face glowing with bright eyes. Henry appeared, still in his splendid robe. He looked at the gown, his expression flickered, but he quickly regained his arrogance. Cheap tricks. I already showed you blooming flowers. Now he is only imitating. Mary, remember, my jewels are worth more than anything. He raised the necklace high before the crowd. The gems sparkled dazzlingly, drawing gasps of admiration. But compared to the gown that breathed fragrance, the cold gleam of the jewels suddenly seemed lifeless. Mary stepped forward. She looked at the necklace, then at the gown. Her heart trembled, but this time with clarity. The jewels shine, but they are cold. Those flowers, they are my husband's blood and breath. Lord Henry, you have money, you have magic, but you do not have love. I choose my husband. The crowd roared. Henry froze, his face flushing red, grinding his teeth. He lunged forward to snatch the gown, but the flowers suddenly burst into radiant bloom, hundreds of petals whirling into a spiral of light. Henry was thrown back, his necklace scattering across the ground. An old man in the market exclaimed, "Jewels fall to the ground and remain mere stones. But those flowers, though fragile, live within the hearts of people." Defeated. Henry clutched his face and fled amidst the laughter and jeers. The arrogant nobleman was finally brought down by the very thing he had always scorned, true love. That night, in their small house, Mary wore the embroidered gown of blooming flowers. She looked at James, her eyes shining. "I am sorry. There were times I doubted, times I strayed, but now I know I only need you." James held his wife's hand, his eyes gentle yet resolute. "We are poor, but poverty is not frightening. Losing each other is what's frightening." They embraced tightly, surrounded by the lingering fragrance of flowers in the air. From then on, James was called the tailor who embroidered living flowers. The villagers respected him and came to order clothes. Yet James remained humble, accepting only what was enough. He often said, "The most precious thing I have is not the clothes, not the flowers, but the wife beside me." Mary would softly reply, "And the most precious thing I have is you." The story closes here, leaving a clear lesson. Wealth, power, magic, all these can sway the hearts of people, but only true love, proven through patience and sacrifice, can keep the heart steadfast. Jewels that fall to the ground are only stones. Flowers that bloom from love will live forever in human memory.